One of the main areas where church, state and other faiths intersect in New Zealand is in interfaith dialogues. There are two main dialogues each year, one early in the year organised by interfaith councils and one mid-year organised by the Human Rights Commission as part of the annual Diversity Forum. I have been attending these meetings since I started in my present role in 2003. I'm pleased to report that the state of these dialogues seems to have improved over that time, and my key point today is that evangelical Christians, who make up over half of the church in New Zealand, need to stay committed to genuine participation in these dialogues. Failure to do so simply means that other voices will have more influence than they should. In the 2008 Congress book, which by the way you can still get a great deal from Helen if you see her in there, I documented the history of the interfaith dialogue in New Zealand up to the publication of the Statement on Religious Diversity in 2007. As a member of the working group for that document, I was disappointed that despite our best efforts, the final document did not fairly reflect the historic role and present-day significance of Christianity in this country. However, it was certainly much better than the original draft, and it did contain a number of important points which should be supported by all Christians. In 2008, the first point in the Statement on Religious Diversity concerning religion in schools was issued as a separate discussion topic by Professor Paul Morris and the Human Rights Commission. We made a submission, collaborated with the Church's Education Commission, who run Bible in schools, assisted a number of other groups with their submissions, and engaged with the Human Rights Commission in a number of direct discussions, including joint video conferences. The final document, published in 2009, again was an improvement on the original, but still fell short of what we thought it should have been. In 2009, another discussion topic was launched from the Statement on Religious Diversity concerning religion in the workplace. I was invited to be part of the reference group for this discussion. Towards the end of the year, I took my concerns over the process which had been followed in the previous discussions to a private meeting with the Human Rights Commission. The main question I asked was, how was the final content for each publication determined? Who got to have the last say, and why should they have it? Whether this meeting had any bearing on the outcome or not, I don't know, but I can say that the process for the religion and workplace discussion seems to have been more robust and more transparent. New Zealand Christian Network organised a meeting in April 2010 for Christian business people and theologians, which was also helpful in the writing of our own submission. I'm also pleased to report that the last draft I saw of the Religion and Workplace document was very close to what we would have written if we'd been asked to go and write it ourselves. Although these discussion documents have no legal weight, they will nevertheless guide policy for government, department, state institutions, and be referenced by the Human Rights Commission in resolving issues that arise in workplace in general. So the Religion and Workplace document represents good progress indeed. 2010 also saw two further discussion topics launched: religion in the media and freedom of religion. I've been told that I'll be invited to be part of the reference group for the media discussion, and we're waiting to see what will come of the religious freedom one. You may recall, I showed you the slide yesterday, that the New Zealand Herald last year showed a stern picture of Race Relations Commissioner Joris de Bress under the heading, "Churches Force Secular Backdown." This is the sort of sensational and exaggerated media headline which might help sell newspapers and might cause some people to cheer, but it was not the truth. And it's unlikely, therefore, that God, who is truth, was amongst those cheering. Neither does it help the relationships which have started to bear good fruit in these dialogues. Certainly there was a strong focus in the Freedom of Religion document about religion in New Zealand being a privatised matter. This was a point we questioned in our written submission and in a meeting with the Commissioner and other faith leaders in a meeting in Auckland last year. But it is absolutely not true to say that we forced anything. And until he read the newspaper, I don't think Joris de Bress thought so either. Possibly the most significant point that we've been able to highlight through these discussions, and in particular in the religion and workplace discussion, is that secular humanism, or rational humanism, are comprehensive belief systems in their own right, just like Christianity or any other religion. Secularists have absolutely no right to have a final say in religious discussions. as if they hold some privileged, lofty position above Christianity and other religions. It may take some time for this to penetrate thinking and dialogue in the public square, but I believe the ground is shifting. Thank you.
Just thought this quote from Obama after the recent Chisholm shootings is appropriate for us today. We recognize our own mortality and are reminded that in the fleeting time we have on this earth, that what matters is not wealth or status or power or fame, but rather how well we have loved and what small part we have played in bettering the lives of others. Glyn asked me to address this topic, the gospel, the state, and other faiths. And this is a very relevant issue for us in Europe as well as here in New Zealand. And I want to start by saying this first decade of the new millennium has seen several cross-currents emerge that are buffeting our society, causing us to do a lot of hard thinking and promise a challenging decade ahead. And identify these three particular cross-currents as being of utmost urgency for us to equip ourselves to respond in a truly Christ-like way. Firstly, the cross-current of secularization versus de-secularization. And second, the Islamization of the West versus the Westernization of the Muslim world. And thirdly, the biblical spirituality versus non-biblical spirituality. Now that cross-current is deep and under the surface. We're not so aware of that as we are of some of these other cross-currents, but nevertheless, I'm going to say that this is perhaps the greatest challenge that we face in Europe, which may surprise you. So, as we seek to disciple the nations, our commission, and to bring transformation in society, these cross-currents converge to confront us with one of the most pressing issues of the coming decade relating to the gospel, the state, and other faiths. Now, what may be missing in that title is perhaps the word society, because society and the state are two distinct things. We'll come to that. But it throws up this question. How can we bring people together, both religious and secular, with clashing systems of belief, into a cohesive society? We're going to ask ourselves, is this really an issue for the church? Well, I'm going to suggest we need to understand the times, and then we need to know what Israel should do. And we have a gospel. It's a gospel of truth. It's a gospel of love. And it's a gospel of hope. Now, these are the soft powers of the gospel that over time have conquered empires, that have tamed tyrants, that have reconciled enemies, and that have transformed communities. John Hus, the Czech reformer, had as his motto, truth prevails. And he wrote from Constance back to Prague to say to the students, always remember, truth prevails, as he was facing his own martyrdom there in 1415. And that has become the motto of the whole nation. It's on their flag. It's in the presidential motto. Truth prevails. I'm more and more convinced that truth and love are such powerful weapons that we as the body of Christ have. But so often we're tempted to go other routes. So let's look at this first one, the secularization versus de-secularization, cross-current going on in our world. Recently I took a tour of people through the streets of Amsterdam. And I've come to see that Amsterdam, in some ways, is the womb of the modern world. So much was birthed out of Amsterdam. Cities like New York, St. Petersburg, Cape Town, Jakarta, and so forth. The first limited company was set up there, the multinationals, the East India Company, so many things. But you see so graphically in the city centre of Amsterdam there, the whole process of secularization that, would you believe, began really with the Renaissance and the Reformation. We may not be used to thinking in those terms. But you see, immediately when the Reformation was adopted in Amsterdam, all these cloisters, there were 20 of them in the inner city there, were secularized. Now, that didn't mean they were robbed of faith content. That wasn't the original meaning of the word secular. Secular comes out of the church language. You had regulars and you had seculars. And, but they were now secularized to become orphanages, libraries, eventually universities. The East India Company took over one of these old cloisters and so on. And thousands of monasteries and convents across Europe were secularized at the time of the Reformation. But of course later on, when the Enlightenment came on, the age of modernity, secularization was denuded of the faith content, and that word secular came to mean devoid of faith, at least faith in God. As Glyn's just said, it was full of faith, but faith in a different area. So the modern assumption was that as nations developed and education advanced, religion and superstition would be marginalized and eventually disappear. Now, Europe, of course, was leading the way, the rest of the world would follow. Has that happened? No. In the last decade or more, sociologists have woken up to the fact that what was supposed to have happened didn't happen, and now they're talking about the myth of secularization. And as Grace Davy puts it, Europe is actually the exceptional case when we look at the global scene. Peter Berger, sociologist, wrote in the New York Times in 1968, by the 20th century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. But in 1999, he changed his tune and he edited this book called The Desecularization of the World. Some of you will know. The assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. And then we see there are many books we could have referred to here, but Alistair McGrath's The Twilight of Atheism, in which he spells out atheism as a parasite. It exists because it's always against something else. And most surprisingly in the last couple of years, John Micklethwaite and Adrian Walbridge, two editors of The Economist, one's an agnostic, the other is a Catholic of some sort, they came out with this book called God is Back. And they were writing for a secular audience, saying, we must get to grips with this. The world has changed. The world is changing. The American model of free market religion is taking over, and God is back on the global scene. And then Philip Jenkins, historian from the University of Pennsylvania, has written a series of books. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. The first one of note really was the Next Christendom, in which he declares that the greatest single factor that's going to shape the 21st century, socially, politically, economically, and spiritually, is the rise of the non-Western church. He said this has not yet come on the radar of most academics, but this is a tsunami that is coming. So we find ourselves living at a most interesting juncture of history, because you see, this has been a centuries-long process of secularization, but suddenly, in our time, something is happening. Now, the story of the modern nation-state is very closely tied to this story, and it's also very closely tied to the Reformation. We all hear about the very nasty religious wars that happened that discredits all religion, and Richard Dawkins talks about how everything evil comes out of religion and so on. Those religious wars were really the convulsions of trying to find an appropriate new political order that emerged past the feudal hierarchical structure of the Holy Roman Empire and so on. And what Luther set into operation was a process that was requiring an appropriate new wineskin for society, for the state, for politics. And so out of this came this compromise formula. As the prince sowed the religion. You see, what the assumption was that every nation state would still be homogeneous. Lutheran, Reformed, Catholic. There was no place for the Anabaptists, of course, and so they were ruthlessly persecuted by all the parties. Tolerance took a long time to emerge, and as we walk through the streets of Amsterdam, we find these schuilkerken, the clandestine churches, hidden churches, Catholic ones way up in an attic, Mennonite ones behind facades of houses that just look like normal houses, but in fact, there's a large church behind. It took a long time for this tolerance to emerge. And the Enlightenment had both its good components and its negative, but following Napoleon's conquest, brought constitutional separation of church and state in several countries, but very often French style. Now what this really meant was, and what this has emerged in our modern time, is that the only faith allowed in the public square was that of the secularist. Well, they will say there is no faith, but they're fooling themselves. They're demanding the monopoly, as Glyn was just saying.